She laughed when I told her I'd lost the contract. Not the warm, sympathetic laugh you give when trying to lighten bad news, but the sharp, almost private kind, the sort of laugh you don't expect from someone who's supposed to be in your corner. We were standing in the kitchen. I just hung up the phone with a client I'd worked with for 23 years. They were going in a different direction, which is corporate language for, "We don't need you anymore." I still had the phone in my hand when she said, without looking at me, "Well, maybe they just needed someone a bit more current." She opened the fridge and bent down as if searching for something, but her voice hung in the air like a gnat you can't swat away. I stood there, watching the refrigerator light spill across the floor. Current. She'd never used that word with me before. I knew what it meant. In my line of work, current isn't about skill, it's about image. And if she was thinking it, maybe others were too. She closed the fridge, holding a bottle of water, and twisted the cap with one hand. "Don't look at me like that," she said, a faint smile tugging at her mouth. "I'm just saying maybe it's time to, evolve a little." There was no malice on her face, but there was no softness either. It was the casualness that cut me. Like my loss was a passing inconvenience, not a moment worth sitting with. I wanted to tell her that I'd built my career on more than image, that I'd kept a steady through years when others were scrambling. But I didn't. I just nodded once and turned away. I've always believed real cracks don't show up with a bang, they start hairline thin. That moment in the kitchen was mine. Later that day, I watched her from across the living room. She was scrolling her phone, the same faint smile on her lips. I thought about how quickly she'd moved on from the conversation, how my news didn't even ripple the surface of her attention. It was strange, like she'd already processed the loss before I even told her, as if she'd expected it. That night over dinner, I mentioned that the client had been with me since before we were married. I was fishing not for pity, but for some recognition of the weight of it. She speared a piece of asparagus and said, "Well, maybe they just wanted some fresh ideas." "You've been doing the same thing a long time, haven't you?" She didn't look up when she said it. The food tasted like paper after that. I watched her pour more wine, top off her glass, and I realized I was cataloging her words instead of engaging in them, filing them away somewhere quiet in my head. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because I was thinking about the lost contract, but because I was thinking about the way she said current and fresh ideas as though they were gentle suggestions when they were really quiet verdicts. I'd heard plenty of blunt feedback in my life, but it never felt this selective, like she wasn't speaking for herself alone. In the days that followed, I caught myself watching her more closely. It wasn't suspicion, not yet, just a shift, a new filter over the same scenes. She'd get a text and tilt the phone slightly away as she read it. When I'd ask who it was, she'd shrug, "Just someone from the club." Her tone stayed the same, polite, composed, but there was a subtle coolness behind it. I found myself replying in shorter sentences, not to match her distance, but to keep my footing. One Saturday morning, we were both in the garage. I was looking for an old fishing reel. She was moving boxes around near the workbench. She held up one and asked if I still needed it. It was full of archived project binders, contracts, notes, old business cards. "Why keep this?" she said, setting it down with more force than needed. "Half of these people probably don't even remember you." I didn't answer. I just took the box from her and slid it onto a shelf. But something in me settled then, not anger, not even hurt. Just a sense that I was no longer looking at an isolated comment in the kitchen. This was a pattern. That night I poured myself a drink after she went to bed and sat at the dining room table in the dark. I replayed her words, the way she didn't meet my eyes when she spoke them, the subtle emphasis on current, fresh, don't even remember you. They were seeds, and I had a feeling they'd been planted long before that day. For the first time in our marriage, I wondered who she was really talking to when she spoke to me. And once that question landed, it didn't leave. The confirmation didn't arrive as a confession. It came as a link, sent with the kind of cheer people use when they think they're passing along something harmless. A mutual friend texted, "Thought you'd appreciate the throwbacks from the fundraiser. Tag yourself if you want." I was at my desk, clearing old invoices, when the message lit up my screen. I clicked because that's what you do when you're trying to feel normal. The album was the usual parade. Small plates balanced on napkins, careful smiles, a rented ballroom pretending to be grander than it was. I scrolled with a steady finger. In one photo, she stood near the bar, head tipped toward a man just out of frame, the line of her mouth soft in a way I hadn't seen pointed at me in months. It could have been an accident of light. It could have been nothing. I told myself that once and kept scrolling. Then the comments opened like a second room. People traded little jabs and hand claps. Buried beneath the usual noise, I saw her name paired with a short sentence that didn't belong to an audience. Loved our late chat about refreshing old brands. The words were innocuous in daylight, but the timestamp was after midnight. The reply came from a username I recognized only after a beat, like seeing a face with a beard shaved off. He'd worked with me years ago, briefly, before shifting into a different lane. We'd kept a cordial distance since. His reply read, "You're right, some things time out." There was a winking emoji I didn't need to see. I stared at those two sentences and felt the air cool around me. The specifics didn't matter, tone does. Tone tells you who is aligned with whom. Tone tells you who expects the other to understand. I clicked through to the commenter's profile and saw a familiar picture. Him at a charity golf event, his hand on my wife's shoulder in a crowd shot, the angle casual and proprietary at once. "I've been invited that day and passed, too much work," I said. She'd come home tired and generous with praise for the organizers. She'd given me a summary like a weather report. Nothing in her voice hinted at midnight discussions about refreshing anything. I didn't address it with her. That isn't my way. Instead, I kept reading because reading is a polite form of listening. A few threads later, a different friend posted a short video from the same night. Laughter, glass clinks, a pan across the room. Briefly, the phone landed on my wife and the same man in profile, their heads close, the kind of closeness you use when you don't want the rest of the table to hear. The audio caught fragments enough to stitch meaning. She said, light and confident, "He holds on to legacy like it's still the market." He nodded, smiling, and answered, "That's where opportunity lives." The camera kept moving. I sat back, hands flat on the desk. I didn't need a confession. That sentence was a key that opened several doors at once. Lost contract, tilted phone, the new habit of speaking about me in museum terms. I tested the moment for anger and didn't find it. What I found was a clearing. Doubt is noisy, certainty is quiet. My mind did what it's always done when the stakes rise. It started listing tasks. I watched her more carefully after that, not with suspicion, but like a craftsman examining a structure he knows he'll have to repair or leave behind. She started keeping her phone face down with the sound off, then in a different room. When she laughed at a text, she stood up to refill water she didn't need. I kept my voice even and asked about nothing. Distance performs better when it believes it's unobserved. 2 days later, the same friend who shared the album sent a follow-up. "Forgot to tag you in this one. Look who's talking growth." The clip was shorter, a stage panel from a networking event. My wife was in the second row, leaning forward the way she does when she wants to be seen listening. On stage sat the man from the comments, introduced as a strategist. He told a story about outdated practices blocking innovation. It was a good story, polished. As the crowd applauded, the camera swung back and caught my wife's hands as the first to come together. There are facts and there are patterns. Facts exist alone, patterns travel in packs. The pattern was obvious now. Public praise for a man describing my field as tired, private late-night messages hooked to that theme, and a domestic script where I was urged to be more current. I didn't feel let down in the old hot way. I felt moved to the edges of my own life. I closed the laptop and walked outside. The yard was the same as it had been the day before, grass needing the same cut, tools hanging in the same silent order. That steadiness helped. I began to list what mattered: protect the business, secure the contacts who still called me by name, move sensitive files to private storage. I didn't tell myself a story about fairness. I told myself what to do next. That evening, while she chopped vegetables, she glanced at the wall clock as if measuring me against the hour. "Big day tomorrow?" she asked without turning her head. I rinsed the cutting board and said, "Some calls." She smiled at her reflection in the window. "Try to sound open," she said, the word slow and shaped. "People want that." I dried the board carefully and slid it into the rack. I said nothing because explanation was no longer currency between us. The confirmation, I realized, wasn't just the digital breadcrumb trail. It was the rhythm of her small rehearsals, phrases repeated, a pose adopted, a set of opinions adjusted just enough to be called neutral. She had constructed a narrative where I was the artifact and the other man was the future. It didn't need to be said aloud to be effective. It needed only to be performed often enough. A week later, a client I'd considered steady called with polite hesitation. He used slow words that tried to be kind. Somewhere in the conversation, he mentioned he'd heard I might be winding down. I asked where he'd heard it, keeping my tone mild. He cleared his throat and shifted to a different topic, not answering. When we hung up, I didn't mistake his silence for mercy. I'd been in rooms like that. I knew how rumors pass through them like shared air. I opened the fundraiser album one more time and read the midnight comment again, then the reply. This time it wasn't the content that struck me, it was the publicness. None of it was hidden. It lived in plain view, cushioned by the assumption that I wouldn't look or, if I did, I'd call it nothing. The disrespect wasn't the act, it was the confidence I wouldn't see the act at all. That night I began the first small preparation. I backed up my client files to a separate drive, labeled innocuously. I printed 2 contracts I'd previously kept digital only and placed them in a manila folder where I keep passports and birth certificates. I checked the expiration dates on a few licenses and set quiet reminders. Each task was a stitch pulled from a shared seam. The garment still looked intact, but it would not hold under pressure. She came into my office doorway later, leaning on the frame. "You're quiet," she said, the words light as glass. I closed a drawer and met her eyes. "Just focused," I answered. She held my gaze a second longer than usual, then nodded and walked away. I listened to her footsteps move down the hall and pictured the late-night glow of her phone highlighting a name that wasn't mine. The doubt was gone. Preparation had taken its place. I didn't need more proof than I already had. What I needed now was patience and a steady hand on the things I could still keep. When you stop believing someone's words, you start watching the spaces between them. That's where I lived now, in the pauses, the glances, the way she staged a moment for others to see. To anyone on the outside, we looked steady. We still showed up together at dinners, still smiled in photos, still traded lines that sounded like marriage. But the script was hers now. She spoke about us as though we were an ongoing renovation. We were trying new things. We were adjusting to the times. I recognized the phrases. They were the same ones the man from the fundraiser used when talking about outdated systems. It wasn't what she said in those moments that got me. It was the performance of it. She would rest a hand lightly on my arm, tilt her head toward me like we were in sync, then aim her words at whoever was listening. It was a picture frame and I was the backdrop. I didn't push back. That would have fed the narrative she was quietly building, that I was defensive, resistant, holding on to the past. Instead, I let the frame hold. I became an observer of my own life. Small withdrawals came naturally. I stopped sharing the day's details over dinner. I stopped asking about her networking evenings. She noticed, I could tell, not from her questions, but from the way she filled the silence with commentary about other people. "Mark's really struggling to keep up," she'd say while scrolling her phone. Or, "Lisa's thinking about rebranding her business before it's too late." The examples were never random, they were rehearsals. Each one another way to reinforce that change was survival, and those who resisted would fade out. I started keeping my own rehearsals, though mine were quieter. I backed up older client communications, made discreet calls to long-term partners under the pretense of catching up. I confirmed contact information, updated addresses, moved a few sensitive conversations off email entirely. None of it left a visible mark in our shared life, but the structure beneath was shifting. Her online presence began to sharpen. I noticed she posted more group shots, always with her position near him, never directly beside but close enough to catch the association. In captions, she talked about fresh perspectives and exciting collaborations. She never mentioned me, but she didn't have to. The omission worked harder than inclusion ever could. One night I sat in the living room with a book while she spoke on the phone in the kitchen. She didn't lower her voice, but she paced a slow back and forth, bare feet on tile. I couldn't make out every word, just fragments. "The push he needs," and "already showing signs," and then laughter, low and knowing. When she hung up, she walked past me without a glance, the faintest scent of her perfume trailing behind. I began timing my departures. If she had a dinner out, I'd leave the house earlier in the day, be gone when she got ready. If she asked where I'd been, I'd give short, accurate answers, meeting, errand, but never the full map. The less she could place me, the more I could place myself where I needed to be. She kept the image intact for friends. At gatherings, she'd lean toward me with a question she already knew the answer to, or mention something about our shared goals, with a smile just wide enough for the group. I'd return the smile, nod in the right places, and watch her believe she was still in control of the story. Control, though, is slippery. I saw it in her eyes the night a mutual acquaintance asked if I was considering stepping back from work. She covered quickly, laughing it off, but I caught the flicker, the brief, sharp calculation of how much I might know. I didn't give her an answer. I just sipped my drink and let the silence stretch until the conversation moved on. From then on, I noticed a faint urgency in her staging. More posts, more dinners, more positioning beside people who could amplify her version of events. She spoke of future plans in vague but confident terms, her eyes sliding past me as if to measure who else was listening. I stopped looking for cracks in her performance. They didn't matter anymore. My role was to let her keep performing until she no longer realized the stage she stood on was already being dismantled. At night, I'd sit in my office with the light low, reviewing documents, confirming account settings, setting reminders for key dates. Each click, each quiet task, another step away from her script. She thought she was building a new story. I was making sure mine had a clean exit. The distance between us grew without argument, without any scene she could point to as the cause. It was just there, a space that once held conversation and now held only the sound of separate lives running parallel. And she never once asked why. The end didn't start with a suitcase. It started with a password. I changed the login to my primary business account on a Thursday morning while she was still asleep. I'd woken early, the kind of early that comes not from rest but from resolve. The cursor blinked as I typed the new string of letters and numbers, one she would never guess. When the confirmation screen appeared, I felt no thrill, only the calm of something necessary being done. From there, it became a routine. Each day, I shifted one small piece. A shared credit card quietly downgraded to my name alone. A storage unit lease, the one that held boxes of archived files and old contracts, moved to a separate account. Insurance policies checked, beneficiaries reviewed. It was like easing valuables from a house before the storm hit, one trip at a time so no one noticed the weight leaving. She still thought the weather was clear. Her days followed their rhythm: calls, networking lunches, the occasional night out. Sometimes she'd update me in passing, as if still playing the part. We might collaborate on a panel next quarter, or he's got some fascinating ideas about growth. I'd nod like a man listening to market forecasts that no longer applied to his investments. I began keeping physical copies of certain documents in a flat leather portfolio that fit easily into my briefcase. If she noticed its sudden regular presence, she never said. The portfolio came with me everywhere now, to the office, to a client meeting, even to the hardware store. Emails to key partners shifted subtly. I framed them as planning for next year, but each contained quiet instructions: move communications to secure channels, send physical correspondence to my P.O. box rather than the house. No urgency, no hint of fracture, just careful rerouting. The more I withdrew, the more she leaned into the performance. At a small dinner with friends, she described me as reassessing his role in the business world, making it sound like a curated sabbatical rather than a slow removal from her reach. I smiled through it, adding nothing, watching her collect nods from across the table. She still had no idea that the structures she counted on, accounts, access, the professional ties she'd been quietly distancing herself from, were no longer hers to influence. One evening, she mentioned that the man from the fundraiser was considering a joint venture with a few select people. She didn't name me, but her tone carried the implication that my inclusion was uncertain. I remember setting my glass down slowly and saying, "Sounds like you've got a lot to coordinate." She studied me for a beat, perhaps expecting a question. When I offered none, she moved on. That was the first time I sensed she felt the shift, even if she couldn't name it. I planned my exit the way I'd planned business deals, with timelines, contingencies, and minimal noise. There would be no confrontation in the house, no dramatic scene that could be recast later as me overreacting. My departure would be a matter of paperwork, locks, and keys changing hands. By late spring, the essentials were under my sole control. The business accounts were sealed, the client list secured. Even the old family trust, something she'd shown little interest in until recently, had been quietly amended under the advice of a lawyer I'd known for decades. The day before the final step, I moved my remaining personal files into the back of my car. She was upstairs on a video call, laughing in that careful, measured way she reserved for people she wanted to impress. I closed the trunk without a sound and drove to the bank to place the portfolio in a safe deposit box. That night she asked if I was working late the next day. "I might be out," I said, keeping my voice level. She didn't press, just nodded and went back to her phone. In truth, I'd already scheduled the meeting that would finalize the transfer of property titles and dissolve our joint business entity. When the papers were signed, she'd find herself outside the perimeter she'd been circling for months. The morning of I left before she woke. No note, no announcement. Just a steady drive to the lawyer's office where I signed in 3 different places and shook 2 hands. When I returned that evening, nothing looked different. She was in the kitchen, plating takeout onto our dishes, smiling faintly like we'd simply crossed another ordinary day. But in my mind, the line had already been drawn. She was still performing. She didn't yet realize the stage was gone. By the time she noticed, the damage was already done. It started quietly, a shift in how people responded to her. Friends who once commented on every post began leaving polite but vague remarks, or none at all. A few didn't reply to her messages right away. She brushed it off as people being busy, but I recognized the beginning of distance. I didn't interfere. I just kept watching from the edges. 2 weeks after I dissolved the joint entity, she posted a photo from a lunch with him. It was meant to look casual, wine glasses on a sunlit table, their hands positioned just near each other, close enough to suggest familiarity. The caption read, "Fresh ideas, fresh horizons." It didn't take long before someone in the comments wrote, "Didn't he used to work with your husband?" She didn't answer. The comment thread went still for hours before she deleted it. But the internet has its own kind of memory. A friend forwarded me a screenshot without saying a word. Over the next month, small rumors began to surface. A client called to check in and asked, in a carefully neutral tone, if I was aware of some unusual conversations about my business at a recent gathering. I told him I'd heard a few things. He hesitated, then said, "People talk, but, well, it's not flattering for her." Her social media tone shifted after that. Gone were the group shots and bright captions. Now it was single images, a coffee cup, a book on a table, a sunset paired with quotes about change and resilience. They were vague enough to be about anything, but the timing made them transparent. I heard from mutual friends that she'd started mentioning me less in conversation, then not at all. One even told me quietly that she'd tried to frame my business changes as a step back for my own health. "It didn't land the way she thought," my friend said. "But remember how involved you were, and how fast you've moved since." The man from the fundraiser kept appearing at her side in certain circles, but never as openly as before. I wondered if he'd begun to see the same cracks others did. Some of their shared acquaintances still smiled politely when they arrived together, but the warmth was thinning. From my distance, I saw her beginning to scramble, subtle changes in her wardrobe, a new haircut, more frequent posts about events she'd attended without me. Was the same performance, only faster now, as though the pace itself could keep the image from slipping. But it was slipping. One afternoon, I stopped by a local cafe between meetings. 2 tables over, a pair of women were talking in low voices. I wasn't trying to listen, but her name caught my ear. One said, "It's awkward, everyone knew they worked together. Now she's acting like it's this new partnership." The other just shook her head. They never noticed me. I finished my coffee and left without a word. She sent me a brief text that night. "We should talk soon." I didn't reply. The unraveling wasn't loud. It was a slow, steady loss of footing, connections loosening, credibility thinning. She was still in motion, still performing, but the audience was shrinking, and I didn't have to lift a hand to make it happen. Everything I needed was already in place. The rest would take care of itself. The final turn came without warning, at least for her. A mutual friend was hosting a small gathering, nothing extravagant, just a dozen people, some food, and the usual polite talk. I hadn't planned on going, but the host called me personally. "It'd be good to see you," he said, his tone leaving the rest unsaid. When I arrived, the room was already in motion, glasses in hands, conversations overlapping. She was there, standing near the center, the man from the fundraiser at her side. They were angled toward each other, but scanning the room like people making sure their presence was being noted. We hadn't spoken in weeks. She glanced at me only briefly, then returned her attention to the group around her. The host called for everyone's attention to thank us for coming. After the short welcome, he gestured toward me. "Before we get too far into the evening, there's something I think we should clear up," he said. His voice was calm, but the room shifted. I stepped forward, holding a slim folder, nothing dramatic, just a few printed pages. "Some of you have heard stories," I said, my voice steady. "About my business, about my role in it. I thought it best you see the source for yourselves." I opened the folder and read two short excerpts, direct quotes from the public comment threads and a clipped transcript from the panel video, her voice describing me as holding on to legacy like it's still the market. Each line was simple, undeniable. No adjectives, no interpretation. When I finished, I closed the folder and looked up. She stood very still, eyes fixed on me, her expression caught between disbelief and calculation. The man beside her shifted his weight but didn't speak. "I've secured my work and my name," I said. "That's all I wanted to clarify." Then I stepped back, handed the folder to the host, and moved toward the door. No one stopped me. Conversations didn't resume right away. The silence followed me into the night air. The next morning, my lawyer confirmed the final step. Her name was removed from the last shared account that tied her to my business. The paperwork was clean, the protections complete. Over the next week, word circled quietly. She tried to post a few things online, inspirational quotes, photos of herself at events, but the comments were thin, and several of the usual names were missing. I heard from a mutual contact that the man from the fundraiser had other projects now and was spending less time with her. A few days later, she came to my door. No announcement, just a knock in the middle of the afternoon. When I opened it, she stood there with a neutral face that didn't quite hold. "We should talk," she said, her voice softer than usual. I kept my hand on the edge of the door. "There's nothing left to discuss." She looked past me into the house as if searching for something familiar. When her eyes came back to mine, I didn't offer her a place inside. After a moment, she nodded once, almost to herself, and walked away. I closed the door before she reached the street. That was the last time we spoke. Her circles kept shrinking. Mine stayed intact. I never checked to see how far she fell. That wasn't my job anymore. What mattered was that I was gone, and she was left exactly where she'd worked so hard to be. Alone, with the stage lights cooling around her.